binding resolution compelling states to prevent their nationals from joining jihadists in Syria and Iraq. So it's getting a lot of attention. This is the front page of L'Orient Le Jour, the Lebanese paper. It talks about the UN launching a crackdown on jihad recruits. And the New York Times, in its editorial, really applauds this new focus on foreign fighters. It's significant that world leaders realize the need to take action. The numbers are pretty incredible. According to U.S. intelligence officials, about 15,000 citizens from 80 countries are now fighting with the Islamic State group in Iraq and Syria. This includes more than 2,000 Europeans and 100 Americans. So the New York Times says this resolution may help, but it's that being provided that it is not used by leaders as a pretext for laws that will further constrain civil liberties.
And some of the papers taking rather a closer look at exactly what kind of person goes to Syria and Iraq to fight.
Absolutely. Now, there's a very interesting study that was carried out by the University of London, and this is an article in The Independent that's looking at the results. This study was focused on the common characteristics of potential jihadists, and this is quite incredible. The report finds that young British Muslims from families with deep British roots, so who've been living in the UK for generations, are more at risk of radicalization than recent migrants to Britain. And the study finds that migrant groups are actually much stronger in condemning terrorism because they've invested in going to the UK, whereas people who are, born and brought up in the UK, they often take their security and education and safety for granted. And the report finds that terrorist sympathizers are often financially well off, but feel depressed and isolated. So the findings are very interesting.
Yeah, it does sound an interesting report, doesn't it? Now, the threat of homegrown terrorism is dominating the Australian press today. This is after on Tuesday night an Australian teenager was shot dead in Melbourne after stabbing two counter-terrorism officers.
That's right. The Australian press wonders, is Abdul Numan Haider, was he just an alienated terrorist, a teenager rather, or is he the new face of terror? This is the Daily Telegraph. They are very categorical here. They depict him as a Jihad Joey, and then in a closer look, they take a look at how the 18-year-old of Afghan origin became a terrorist. They're very clear about the fact that he was a terrorist. They talk about going from French fries to fatwa, and they come back on recent events. His passport was actually canceled last week after authorities realized that he was contacting jihadists in Iraq and Syria, and he attacked these police officers in front of a police station, actually, where he'd been called in to discuss his extremist views.
And it comes in a tense context in Australia, doesn't it?
That's right. In recent weeks, the government has raised the national terror alert level to high, and yesterday, Australian lawmakers were discussing introducing new counter-terrorism laws. You can read about them here in The Australian, but a lot of papers are wondering, is this necessary? Is the threat really great? Well, right-wing papers in Australia tend to think that the threat is indeed serious. Let's take a look at this editorial in The Australian, for instance. They say that Australia can no longer hide from the Islamic terror threat. And the Daily Telegraph, another right-wing paper, also agrees and lashes out against people who are trying to downplay the threat of terrorism. You can see here, denial won't stop this evil madness. The country needs these new counter-terrorism laws. But as I said, the left-wing press doubts that there's so much of a threat. I pulled out an article from The Age, for instance, where you can see here that it says that the Islamic State group is not an existential threat to Australia. This is a piece by Jonathan Holmes, a columnist. He says, however, one thing that is an existential threat to Australia is climate change. And he points out that there are more and more laws to stop terrorists, laws that reduce people's freedoms, but there are fewer and fewer laws to limit greenhouse gas emissions.
Interesting way of looking at it. Finally, round of applause for India, successfully putting their satellite, of course, into orbit around Mars.
That's right. Lots of pride in the Indian press. Let's start with the Times of India. On their front page, you can read that India has entered the super exclusive Mars Club. And in its editorial, the Times of India is full of hope. Yes, we can. It calls on the government to use this successful mission as a template for economic liftoff, and lots of papers are really impressed by how cheap this mission was. It was cheap compared to Western standards, $74 million. Here's a fun fact that you can read in the Daily Beast. The first U.S. stealth jet attack in Syria cost more than the Indian mission to Mars.
Okay, interesting figures from Flo Vilmano in the international papers. Thanks a lot. Up for you next, of course, we've got the latest news on the beheading of Hervé Gourdel. We'll bring you that after the break. And as our tour of Paris's diverse cultures continues, today is the turn of the Arab community. That's coming up in focus after the break.